We laugh. We cry. We learn. But really, what doesn't kill you makes you better at managing clients and everyone. I'm Morgan Friedman, and this is Client Horror Stories.
Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Client Horror Stories. We have a very exciting episode that's about to start. A man of many stories and many lives like a cat. Ed Hajim, it's an honor to have you here with us.
Morgan, it's my honor to be here.
It is fun. So, Ed, of your many different crazy client horror stories, we're ready to jump into your favorite. I have my coffee with whiskey in hand.
Yeah, you're right. I've spent time as an engineer, a naval officer, and 50, 60 years on Wall Street. I guess my best stories are Wall Street stories, although if you get a couple of naval officers together, you can tell naval stories all night long. I guess I was the managing partner of a medium-sized investment bank, and we grew the bank from about 20 million revenues to $500 million revenues, and we sold the company twice. First, after 5 years, to Xerox, and then we were part of Xerox for 5 years. Then 5 years later, we sold it to ING. Right before I came aboard, the two partners of the firm decided they didn't really want to run the firm, so they brought me aboard, about $20 million. I decided at that point in time I was going to really grow the firm, and I grew it very rapidly. And some people thought it was great, and others thought it wasn't so great. In about 4 years in, one of the senior partners, actually a name partner, terrific guy, great analyst, smart as hell, came in and said, "Ed, you're doing all the wrong things. You'll end up having the firm drowned in red ink." What?
A quick question. You said he's a name partner. Just so I know nothing about the investment banking world. Does that mean like his name is in the firm's name?
His name was on the door. Yes.
On the door.
On the door. And he was a founding partner. So he was a very smart guy. He said, "You're going to drown." I mean, he came in my office, we're going to drown in red ink. He was a great big guy. I hated to lose him because he was a good analyst and he was a good guy. I thought he was a pretty good guy. And so I said to him, "Jim, you do what you want to do, but I think we're doing the right things." 12 months later, we had a very good year that year. And Xerox, for whatever reason, came in and paid 3 times book, paid over $100 million for the firm. And everybody, obviously, who was a partner, and he would have been a partner, did well. So I'm all fun, smiles, and I'm getting, money, checks going to come in a couple of weeks. And all of a sudden, I get this lawsuit by this wonderful friend of ours, this named partner. Jim sues us because he said basically that we took his stock in when we knew we were going to sell the firm, and therefore he didn't get benefit from the big markup, because a huge markup, because we were, people own the firm at book value, and this was 3 times book, so he lost out on 3 times. So he sued us, and he sued us for for the money that he thought he lost. And I said, you obviously told me you were quitting, we didn't fire you, and so forth and so on. And I said, I'm not going to pay it. Then Xerox called me up and said, "We're not buying the firm unless you clear up all your lawsuits."
Wow.
So sure enough, Jim didn't get all his money, but he got quite a bit of it, and it really irritated me. And it shows you one of the horror stories that no good deed goes unpunished. And the second story.
Before we jump into the second story, some questions about that. So this named partner, his public story was you knew you would sell it, and that's why you did this to me. But when did you speak to him privately, and because privately he knew that he resigned, and it was a different story. Like, was it just a game of his to get money, like people say these things, or was something deeper?
Well, a lot of money involved, and therefore, why not take a shot? I guess one of his lawyers probably said, you can do this, and he did it. And we this was not something between he and I. This went to our executive committee, and a whole bunch of people and so forth. This was very well documented. But I could show all the documentation I wanted. The Xerox lawyer said, very simple: "We're not going to buy your firm unless you're pretty clean of lawsuits." And I could understand that. And the overall, what the money we paid him was, it didn't affect anybody. If you divide it up among all the 25 or 30 partners we had, it was wasn't that much. And
it was a small.
It was quite annoying and quite disturbing. But
It's
because
so
I,
so I
I
think
mean, double, first of all, he was wrong. The firm didn't drown in red ink. Instead, we sold the firm for a very, very fine price and so forth.
so I think there are a few lessons from that story that are interesting to articulate. One lesson that's obvious, but we forget so much, but it's powerful to repeat, is when the numbers get big, when there are lots of zeros after the number, even nice guys become less nice.
I have to take a little blame too. We probably should have documented it more carefully. We probably should have had. He signed a release when he left. That basically he was being paid off for stock, but we didn't get him to sign that he was quitting. We probably should have had a document that said, I'm now hereby quitting the firm, but we didn't do that because he was a named partner and we were friendly. I mean, it wasn't terribly acrimonious. He just disagreed with everything I was doing, and so it was sad because I could have documented. Now that's the lesson you learn when someone does that, because I didn't know we were going to sell a firm, so I didn't think about it. In fact, when Xerox actually came in and said to me, "We'd like to buy your firm," I couldn't believe it, and that was one of the other horror stories. One of my partners said, "Why do they want to buy us?"
So wait, so we'll get to the second story in a second, but I like stretching each story for a few lessons. I think so one lesson is when there's big sums of money involved, nice people become less nice. Another lesson that you just mentioned is that you need to document these things, and you thought you documented it well because you signed the release, but you didn't sign something where it was like he's quitting for these reasons, and that created the ambiguity that let him change the story in the future.
That's right. Exactly right. Then that's a little, you learn lessons and so on. So
one of the points of the podcast is to teach younger professionals and younger versions of ourselves these sorts of lessons that had we known, we would have avoided lots of headaches and had more hair today.
And I'm a little bit of an executive, I'll take some of the blame, but I delegate quite a bit, and once this started was being processed, I delegated it out to our people, to our legal counsel and so forth. And we were a small firm, so we didn't go out and spend a lot of money on legal. And he was a friend of the firm, so we paid him off. And by the way, we paid him off. He did get a nice payday anyway. Yeah. Didn't get 3 times the payday.
Yeah, that is another lesson, that when you delegate things, that there are only 24 hours in a day. You don't have time to look at every little thing. But for important things, such as legal contracts like that, it's worth it to put in a little extra time yourself. There are 2 other lessons I just want to say from your story before I forget them. It's super interesting that you didn't even think you would be selling it to Xerox, so you didn't prepare for that. If you knew you would have prepared for it. But it's such a good example about how really unexpected things happen all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. They happen all the time, and in this case, it was a great experience. But again, I also, another lesson is we could have kept fighting this. So also take the experience into context. Paying him off got the deal done. If I got my ego up, I said, damn it, he's lied to us, and it's illegitimate what he's doing. We're going to fight him to the end. Xerox may have lost interest, who knows, and this was a deal that nobody believed would happen. We were a little tiny firm being bought by this wonderful big firm, and people kept questioning it. And in fact, one of the experiences was a big magazine came into the office and wanted to write a story on it. My partner wanted to be, one of my partners like publicity. And I said, you get those guys out of here right away. The story is not how great we are, but why are they buying this little firm? So I said, and if the publicity came out, we might lose the deal. So that's the big lesson on my mind, was to get it over with and get the deal done, because that was the big number one. Always think what the biggest job is. Biggest job is get the deal done. If this little thing down here is causing problems, get rid of it. If it costs you some money, do it, because otherwise you'll end up fighting wars you shouldn't fight.
By the way, that I think is such an underrated lesson, because I know too many people myself that get stuck fighting minor wars, that they don't even see that the big war is happening at the same time.
Right. That's exactly right.
I remember a few years ago on this podcast, I interviewed a lawyer, and something he said that really stood out in my mind which is he made the observation. He's like, lawyers get rich from people fighting things on principle, and the point he meant was very similar to yours. People say, no, I'm right and they're wrong, and they spend huge amounts of money like to fight it, and the lawyers benefit, but really, like they're not fighting for a practical benefit for the big goal. They're just fighting
keep
for
your
their
eye on
emotions
the
and ego.
objective, right? And don't let minor things get in your way.
I love it.
And I would say within, unfortunately, we got our check on October the 1st, 1987.
No.
3 weeks later, the place crashed, and it was unbelievable. We'd never been able to sell the firm. In fact, for 5 years, or maybe never even survived. And I was among Xerox executives in December, and David Kearns, who was the chairman, pointed. He says, "See, there's Ed Hajim. He's our newest acquisition. Don't ask him why he's smiling." Okay, what do you want to do next? If you have, I can give you another one of those stories about employees, if you like.
Yeah, let's go for it.
No good deed goes unpunished. One of the guys, we had a division, a fixed income division that wasn't doing well, and I was thinking about closing it because it really didn't fit in with our strategy and so forth. And the guy who was running it was a very good guy, nice man. He came to us. Xerox actually gave us the division. Said, "Will you take this division?" And I did. And I shouldn't have probably, but I did. And he was a nice fellow. He worked hard, but he couldn't make a profit. Maybe it was our fault. Maybe it was his fault. Anyway, we decided to close the division down, and we were going to find something else for him to do at the firm because he was a good guy. And he got into some kind of difficulty. It was either family or something, or he just didn't want to stay anymore. So he came to me and said, "I really like to leave, and I'd like my stock, purchased." And I said, "Well, the way we do it is if you leave, you get a piece of paper, a 3-year piece of paper, where every year you get 1/3 of your money back plus interest. That's the way we do it. Because obviously we had to protect the firm, because if you had a half a dozen people leave at one time, it would take the firm's capital out the door." So, and he came back about a week later. He said, "I can't do this. I really need the money now, all of it." And I said, "Can't do it. Here's the documents, of the firm. You're quitting, and it says if an employee quits, he gets one. It's this piece of paper." So I felt sorry for him because he gave me a story which I don't want to disclose. And so I called my CFO up and I said, "Steve, is there some way we can give Frank his money?" He said, "No." But he says, "There is one way." He said, "If we fire him, because we fire him, you got to pay the guy off." So I called Frank and I said, "Frank, the only thing I got to do is fire. You want to be fired?" He said, "Oh yeah, fire me. It's okay." He said, "As long as I get all my money." So I fired him. We put piece of paper together. We were more careful this time. We said,
"You learned the lesson,"
and got it all nailed down this time. And so, everything went well. And like the last time, a year later, the ING comes and pays 6 times our book. This was a really big number. And by the time we'd grown to be a large firm, and so that went through like nobody's business, and everything's fine. I got my checks and so forth. He comes into arbitration. He doesn't sue us. He goes to arbitration and saying, "Yes, we knew that we were going to sell the firm, and therefore that's why we took his stock back." And he was being, his division was being closed down, and we should have done something for him, and so on. We went to arbitration. And arbitration, which I didn't realize was as bad as a legal situation. We were there for 3 or 4 weeks with documents and stuff and so forth. And they, for one session, they said, "Well, look how much money you got out of this," and they had because I was the largest shareholder in the firm, and so forth and so on. We argued for 3 or 4 weeks, and the arbitrators were old timers. They didn't have too much. They weren't too excited about what they were doing anyway. And there were 3 of them, and eventually they after about 3 or 4 weeks of piles of documents, legal costs were almost as much as the guy wanted and so forth. Because then I could fight it. I mean, I had the money in my pocket. We were fighting it from the position of being a part of another firm, and they were going to pay anyway. So anyway, the arbitrators came in. They cut the baby in half. They gave him half of what he wanted. So, but again, the good deed gets unpunished, and there's very little you could learn from that, because we really did everything we could do to protect ourselves, and even then we even fought it, which it ended up being only paying half of it. He also wanted a bonus. The arbitrager gave him no bonus because we proved that his division wasn't making any money, but they did get a payment for part of his stock. So it was one of those things that you sort of live with, and never saw the guy again. And we were friends. I mean, because he was one of my managers. I'd have beer with him regular basis. Nice guy. So it was, but that's what business is all about. And then, Wall Street is Wall Street. You're in Wall Street because you want to make money, and you attract those kinds of people, and they're not bad people. That's just what they like in life, and so you got to live with those sort of things.
Wow. So what's interesting about that story is with your first story, wow, like someone working and leaving in a healthy, positive way, but then coming back like with dollar signs in their eyes. When it happens again, one time is random bad luck, but two times is a pattern.
Well, very few people sell a firm twice in a lifetime. So I sold my firm 5 years, then bought it back, and then 5 years later I sold it. So you you rarely have that kind of and also very surprisingly, the kind of multiple that we got in both cases. Usually sell the firm for some percentage, but this was 6 times in the second time. So it was really pretty big numbers. But also we were a big firm. We had 800 people. So now where do you want to go from here? How about my boss at the major prestigious firm?
I would love to hear the story about your boss at the major prestigious firm. I love the 3-minute stories. Wall Street style, you were very to the point. So, and I appreciate your directed storytelling style. But I want to see for 1 minute before we go to the third story, if there are any other less obvious lessons that we could extract from the second story. I want to point out you threw out a line that I think is interesting, and you're like, we're friends, but I never spoke to him again. And to me, this is like, I just find that like on the like a little bit sad.
I just never saw him again. He disappeared. I never saw him again. I'm trying to think of the lesson I probably could have learned, I suspect, again, is more documentation. I guess, again, not learning anything. And this was nearly 87. I was 10 years later. It was 10 years later. In this case, we paid him off, and he got all the money, that he wanted. And, we felt that we had, I suspect, I don't know what, I don't know if I could document, because he wasn't quitting. He was being fired.
Right.
So in order to help him, we basically told a little white lie, allowing him to get his money, and it was basically in a situation where we really couldn't, we had no legs to stand on, because the only document we had is we fired him.
I think the way you began the story actually is a lesson. You gave away the lesson at the start, which is you began it by saying no good deed goes unpunished. Yeah, and I think
occasionally you do something that, and by the way, the lesson learned is don't break the rules. If I didn't break the rules, I said, Frank, you're stuck. I don't care. It is where the ball bounces. You'll just have to take your piece of paper. All right. And, I don't know what he would have done, but,
actually, by the way, that is such a good and subtle lesson that the rules are there for a reason.
Protection. Exactly right. He had, nothing would have happened. We would have sat through arbitrage. It probably wouldn't have cost us, nearly 7. It was a good chunk of 6 figures on legal costs and so forth. And also putting on your blue suit and white shirt and tie for 3 months, and going to listening to these guys who really don't, the arbitrators are, they're not that knowledgeable about your business. You got to sit down and explain what this is and what that is. And it was just, I had my CFO with me, and I was living in Connecticut, and I had to come into New York to the legal situation. But don't break the rules.
Don't break the rules.
You want to be a nice guy? Don't be a nice guy.
I love it. Subtle, great lesson. There's a variation of that might be useful for our listeners to learn, which is G.K. Chesterton, an early 20th century British thinker and writer. He has this insight that I've long found insightful, which is sometimes called Chesterton's fence. And what Chesterton's fence is he observed, like a fence between two houses, don't take down the fence until you first understand why the fence was put up in the first place. And it's a great observation. Like you want to break the rules. Don't break the rule until you understand why that rule exists, because nice guys you want to help can turn around and act like this.
Well, no, but the rule was put in place to prevent mass liquidation. Yeah. It wasn't put in place that one person, but it was a rule, and it probably did prevent one person from coming back to us. But again, I had no idea that we were going to sell the firm in 12 months. I mean, and by the way, if we had sold the firm 3 years later, it would have been okay, but it was like 8 months later we sold the firm. It's one of those crazy experiences. And by the way, we did the deal in less than 60 days. So that,
wow.
Yeah. In 1997. So, so anyway, that's,
there's one other lesson or psychological insight I want to extract from this, then we'll move to your third story, which is something in common that I realized between both of the stories is both of these not nice people who turned out to be not nice, they both imputed motives on you that you didn't have. Both of them were like they knew they were going to do this. And what I find interesting about that from the psychological perspective is the way a lot of bad people operate is they assign motives to the other side that were never there in the first place.
No, another problem is the vision of me. I was never a killer. There are certain people you don't mess around with. Some other person, if you did what they did, then you might end up, the guys come and do your knees or something, and then that's not. They knew that I wasn't that kind of person.
They knew you were nice.
A little bit softer than I should have been. So there's always two sides to this one. And,
interesting. Yeah. I love the admission that you were a little bit softer, and as a result,
you're taking advantage of.
Take advantage.
But being softer allowed me to run the firm the way I wanted to run the firm. It was a very successful firm, and I feel being the kind of person I was one of the reasons the firm did as well as it did. So you can't. And I have two things I could discuss. I could discuss banking deals, which are horrible, or I could discuss my horrible boss. These guys would have never done to him what they did to me.
So let's see if we have time. Let's see if we have time for both. Let's talk first about your boss.
Okay. This was a very prestigious firm. This is a firm where you went to the dining room and there are white gloved people standing behind you. And here was the Fed chairman or the King of Spain for lunch. I remember one conversation with one of our partners. I said he was our partner in Italy. I said, Mario, where are you? He says, I'm on the Pope's plane. That was one of those kind of firms. Really a wonderful, and the boss the guy who ran it, he was the number 2 guy when I got there. He was the kind of the guy, he and the number 1 guy hired me away from the place that I was operating on, operating at E.F. Hutton. They hired me away. And the only negative I had in moving from the firm was that this guy was well known to be a bad guy. He was a very tough guy. But, given my background in orphanages and foster homes and difficulties, I thought I could get along with anybody, and I could, master anybody. I could, handle anybody. I wouldn't necessarily get a hold of them, but I could deal with them. And the deal they made for me to come aboard was second to none. I mean, they made me a partner, they put me on the board, paid me a bunch of money. It was, and they gave me all the responsibility I wanted. I said, I want to be totally responsible for the whole area, the securities area. It was an absolute mess. The stocks and bonds, trading, sales, and research. That whole area. I also wanted the international part of it. I wanted the retail part of it. I wanted the institutional part of it. And they gave me the whole thing. So I really had my own company inside this very prestigious firm. That was a step up from where I was running one part of it at the other firm. And I went to work, and it was very hard to hire people because people knew about this guy's reputation. He was a bad guy. And I kept saying, he's over here and I'm over there. And actually, he at first kept saying, I've got fixed income, you've got equity. We won't mix each other. You could run your show. And for about 3 years, I actually got the place turned around. There was a merger that occurred before those guys didn't get along. I finally got them to get along. And sure enough, after 3 years, we were in the top 10 or 15 firms from almost no place. And, and I'd sort of build a business, and he was making good money too. And then all of a sudden, during a 3-month period, he had some really bad trading problems. So he calls me up and he says, I'm cutting back some of my staff, and I want you to bring 4 of your people to my office, and I'm going to fire them. I thought to myself, if that occurred and he fired 4 of my people, I'd never be able to hire anybody else on the street because that would be out there the next day. And I can't possibly do that. But he's my boss, and he's told me to do something. And I understand why he's doing it, because the firm's got to make money. And and he's lost this money. Now, he'd made money before, but this time he lost a bunch of money. And so I decided I would go to his office and, arrive there. He looked at me, he says, "Where are the 4 people?" And I said, "Joe, you're looking at them." I said, "You're looking at them. If you want to fire 4 people, why don't you just fire me?" And so he thought about it for a while, I'm sure, but he didn't. But that lesson to learn was to show someone that what he's doing is just totally out of the question, and that you're willing to put your business, your life, your job, everything on the line to prevent this from happening. Because it was no real choice for me. Because if I fired 4 people, my business would go down the drain. Because the word would be out again. Yeah, Ed took 3 years to build this up, but it's the same old firm, the same old crap. That they can't keep people, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, it looked like a very difficult decision at the time. But looking back on it, I really had no choice. I had to show him completely that this was an incorrect decision, and it was a life or death situation for my business, and also to show him that he wasn't really responsible for my business, even though in an organization chart he thought he was.
Wow, that is a great and powerful story. A couple of lessons to take out from there. First, I love your last sentence. You just said he wasn't really in charge of my business, even though the org chart said that he was. And that's a really subtle but important point, because sometimes the org chart says something, but the power dynamics say something very different.
Right.
So therefore, you need to pay attention to that. Another good lesson is when you push back to difficult people or difficult bosses, sometimes you just need to put yourself on the line. And putting yourself on the line is the most important way to show that you're serious about it. And I feel like a lot of people are scared of doing it, but it's often the best strategy.
Well, he could have fired me. He could have, because he had this. He was strong enough to do that. But I had just built this division, and if he fired me, then the whole thing would fall apart, and then that would be embarrassing in this, because I was big enough then in the street. As if he fired me, that would be come out tomorrow in the paper or something. That would be a bad deal. And I took that. And I actually used that, the second part of the story. I used that a couple of times later on when we merged with another major firm. He tried to fire me again, and it didn't work. Because I said to him, if you bring this other guy in to run that division will walk out Monday morning. And so unfortunately, he let the other guy go. He said, then he came back to me later on and said, I don't like you, but I liked him less than I liked you. So I ended up staying in that business. But he did come after me again because he wanted to take over my business, and he was strong enough that he was able to do it. And he convinced the executive committee, the board that I was on. We had another division called the money management business, and it was really in trouble. It had gone from 3 billion to 1.5 billion. Management was having a lot of trouble, and I was the only guy with experience in the money management business. I'd come from a money manager in California. And so I knew that business really well. So he convinced the chairman who brought me in basically, and everybody else, that I was the only guy to take it over. And so he pushed me out of my position into running this. But I did a lot of concessions from him. I got the idea that I was going to run it 100%, and they would leave me alone. This was my business, and it would be fine. And also they gave me a car and driver and a few other things that made things much easier because I was living in Connecticut. And so I took the job, but it was a sidebar for the whole firm. If I was interested someday in becoming more important in the firm, I'd basically can my career. Well, much to his dismay, within 2.5 years, I had raised $7.5 billion, and we were a profitable part of the firm, and we didn't use any of the firm's capital. And, I was a minor hero. I mean, because it was a sidebar for the firm, people didn't give me a grip, but the general partners were very pleased with the fact that I turned the business, which was an embarrassment, around into a firm that was absolutely growing like hopsy. And so he came to me at that point in time, and he wanted to push out the chairman, who was a really good guy. The chairman was a guy who could talk to almost anybody. I mean, I worked with him on a couple of things where he would have a senator on the phone, and he put the Fed chairman on hold. I mean, the guy was he was really a smart businessman and very well known. He actually was a cabinet member in, I think, Nixon's cabinet. And so he was a really, well-known international type. And so on. Later on, he became a billionaire and running. Anyway, so Lou, this guy came to me and said, there's only 9 people on the board. I need your vote to push him out. because I think he's not good for the firm. And I said, no, Lou, you don't understand. This guy puts his tuxedo on 4 nights a week. You don't like to do that. He does a lot of things you don't do. You don't like to do. You do things that he can't do. The two of you run the firm great. And he said, you're either going to back me or else. And I said, no, I'm not backing you. Sorry. And that was he was bad. So about a month later, I got a call, and I thought maybe they're going to put me on the executive committee because I turned this firm around and was making money. Instead, they told me they're going to move me from my present job, become a banker, because they needed someone in the banking division who was good at bringing in clients, which of course was all bull. He just wanted to move me out of, because I had a division now with 200 people in it and 10 billion under management. And so he pushed me out. And by the way, the chairman who, I was supporting didn't back me. And it's in a book called The Greed and Glory of Wall Street. And they all said what happened to Hajim was crazy. And it was ridiculous pushing him out. Anyway, this is a lesson, a personal lesson, which I tell people. In fact, I just finished a podcast earlier today. What's the most important lesson you learn in your life? And I said, never be a victim, no matter what it is. So this was a situation that was not my fault. It was all his fault. And I could have fought him because I was the chairman of outside mutual fund boards, a bunch of boards, which I could have gone to the press with. In fact, I could have probably almost taken the division out of the firm. But instead of that, I focused my energies, as I've done all my life, on what's next. So I took that energy of being a victim, hating people, criticizing this guy, and focused on what's next. And I found, actually, I didn't find, they found me. When they found out that I was available, 2 of these partners from this small investment bank called me and said, we'd like you to run the firm. That's what I really wanted to do anyway. I could have probably forced my way into staying at this place and spent the next 10 years miserable with these people. In fact, I'm glad I found my dream job, which was to be the senior officer of a small firm where I could put my passions, my principles, find my partners, and build my plans, do the thing I always wanted to do in my life. I didn't have enough money to just quit. So this wasn't an easy decision, but that happened to occur because I focused on what's next. As soon as I found out that I was once I took the job, just being a banker, I went out and put my hook out and found out what was going on. These 2 guys came in right away and said, if you're free, we'd love to have you come to the firm and run the firm. And so that was a real break. And I could have spent a lot of time with lawyers and boards and so forth to figure out how I could, fight this guy, but not fighting him and focusing on what's next. And I say that was hard. I had to make sure I couldn't go out there and say, I'm available. I'd suddenly figure out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to do it, and find a few friends and find out exactly what was available out there. And it was a great idea. It changed my life. For the next 20 years, I ran this small firm and had a ball. And it was a great pivot for me in my life. So that's another whole real lesson, is that sometimes when things are ridiculously difficult and wrong and so forth, maybe a great shot may come. All things maybe come out. That's what should have happened. I'm a little bit of a fatalist. By the way, the firm 7 months after I left went bankrupt. Well, they didn't go bankrupt. They sold out at a very low price to another firm because he started doing some trading and lost some money, and they had some disruption, and they sold out to another firm. So
it's an amazing story. I really like your insight to, no matter what happens, never be a victim. And I think there's you're making a subtle variation of that point, which I really like, which is I would reframe what you're saying like this. You're basically saying you have a limited amount of energy, and if you expend energy being a victim, you just won't have enough energy left in order to move ahead.
You're quoting me. That's exactly what I said. Use your energy that you would have used in being a victim to find out what's next, which is you only have a limited amount of what I call psychic energy. You just don't have it. You run out of energy. Yeah.
I read your mind, and you're going to say it, but I like your phrase, psychic energy.
No, it is, because or creative energy. You need and you just have actually there's some books written on. You have about 2 hours a day. If you use it up being a victim, it's gone. And you can be tired out too. You can, because you're going to be using this creative energy to figure out what lawyer to figure out how to get this guy, for what statements he made. Forget it. What's next? And I think that early in my life the same thing happened to me, only a little bit more my fault. And focusing on what's next, I changed careers, and I met a guy, and he made me a senior vice president of a firm, and off we went. And I didn't look back.
your insight that you only have about 2 hours of creative or psychic energy a day. So don't use it on being a victim, using it on moving ahead. We can also apply this to the first two stories that you told at the start of our podcast, because having to put on a suit, go to the courthouse every day is just like emotionally mental. It drains your psychic energy.
And you got to put a price on that.
Completely. Do you have time for one final quick story, and then we can wrap up?
Well, the idea when you're in a business to have certain tenets that allow you to make decisions a little earlier is a principle that I found helped me enormously in Wall Street. I'll give you a couple quickies. A young banking partner came to me and said, "I've got a fabulous deal, probably one of the biggest deals that the firm has ever done." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." He said, "Well, the client is a Russian and Cyprus citizen." Check. Don't do that. Don't do that. And I said, "Well, what's the business?" He said, "Used cars." Check. Not such a good business. Where are the used cars? They're going to be, bought in Europe and sold in Africa. So all of a sudden, my antenna up, and I come to say that I got to find something else wrong with this so I can reject it. Yeah. So I said, bring the client in. Let's talk. So he brings this client. The guy's very well dressed, very well spoken. Obviously, he's obviously Russian, but he speaks English brilliantly. Probably went to Harvard or someplace. And so I said to him, to tell me the deal. He told me the deal how he's going to buy these cars. I suspect they're going to be, I told him they're probably stolen cars, but he's going to sell them in various African countries. And it was just a bad idea. Well, I said, "So how are you going to pay for our services?" And he reaches in his pocket and he pulls out a little bag and he pours out diamonds on my desk. And so I said, "Excuse me," took the banker in the next room. I said, "You get this guy out of here right now and never bring him back." So that's one story where, you get these checks that you only need one more thing to strike out. And that was an obvious one. And it's even quicker than that. One of the days I was the chairman, so I didn't do many banking deals. I sort of looked over them. And one of my partners, who was a very, very good banker, had a couple of guys that he wanted to do a big movie deal with. And then we were in the media business. And I was a little late getting to the luncheon. And I got to the luncheon and I walked in and I smelled pot. The guys are smoking pot in our corporate dining room. And I said, "No, this is not for me." And so we went through the whole process, and some of the numbers weren't exactly right. And I talked my partner out of the deal, and he was pissed. He was unhappy. They were good guys. He knew these guys. Well, somebody else did raise the money for him, and they went belly up in a very short period of time thereafter. So, little indications like that. And over a lifetime, you pick up things where you say, that's not a good idea. I've been there, done that before, and I don't want to make that mistake again. So that's really a lesson learned. And what you should do when you're in any business is pick up a series of tenets, almost second nature to you, that you basically have got to stay away from. And I've done some obvious ones. There are obviously much more subtle ones, like certain accounting principles that people use that are not correct. You see that, wait a second, what about that deferred maintenance? What about that tax situation? Those are much more complicated and not fun. These were two fun ones that sort of, told me right away that I was in deep water and I got to be careful.
I love that. I also like your word tenets. I do the same, but in Morgan language, I call these rules of thumb. And I'm a big fan of just defining rules of thumb for everything for a reason you were hinting at when you started this portion of the commentary, which is it's basically cognitive intensive to make decisions. But if you have rules of thumb, which are basically in the default situation of this type, here's what I do, and there's a really, really high bar in order to make any non-default decision to change your mind, it takes so much of the cognitive load off so you can focus your mind on newer and different questions.
Yeah, because you get somebody that's got a bad past record, you got to, if the thing is not perfect, you should stay away from it, obviously. There's another deal out there that I always convince my bankers, There's plenty of things to be done in the world. Find something that doesn't have hair on it, or if it has hair on it, make sure you do a very good job of making sure this is the last of the hair. So.
But by the way, I'll add a interesting footnote to that, which is I've also found a lot of these rules of thumb change depending on the context. For example, like I now live in Argentina, and I've bought and sold a few houses in Argentina. My house I actually bought from the former vice president of Argentina. But here's an interesting fact about Argentine real estate. 100% of Argentine real estate is bought and sold in US dollars, physical dollar bills. I've owned multiple houses for more than $1 million with piles of cash. And me, like as an American, like where everything is a wire, I would have been freaked out. No, this is what drug dealers do. But in the context of Argentina, that's just how the real estate industry goes.
Well, the same thing happens in environments in Wall Street. When things get really hot, you tend, the guys keep coming in, the next deal. You'll let a deal slip by because you got too many things going on. And these, it's like everything else. Everything's contextual. I believe life is contextual. I say to people, find your passions. Well, find your passions. Your passions in Kiev are different than your passions in New York City. Everything's contextual in my mind, and you have to pay attention to that.
I love it. Ed, it's been wonderful having you on the podcast. Great getting to know you. Some interesting new and surprising lessons. Thank you very much for your time here.
My publisher said, make sure you tell people to follow me on Instagram, and you can check my website, or else I get in trouble if I don't say that. And if you read my book, make sure you give me a rating and a review, please.
and buy your book. And you
can listen to it too if you don't like buying it. So it's both on tape. So,
and in the show notes we can put links to everything as well, just to make your publicist happy.
Thank you so much. This has been fun. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, and everyone who's made it to the end. Thank you for watching it. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we had. Until next time.